Now, Africa's economies have been riding the crest of a global commodity wave that could transform the continent's prospects. This is Africa's chance to lift millions out of poverty and improve the prospects of generations to come. Africa continues to be the preferred investment destination for both advanced and emerging economies, with 2014 registering a record inflow of $80 billion, according to the International Monetary Fund. The continent registered an average growth rate of 5.5% in 2014, and 2015 projections show this trend continuing, with the fastest growing economies on the continent registering up to 7% growth rates. Now, Africa's natural resource base remains its biggest assets, with oil and gas exports continuing to earn valuable foreign exchange. In 2010, the U.S. Department of Energy estimated Africa's oil and natural gas reserves to be between 200 and 210 billion barrels. Now, Africa has more than 30% of the world's mineral reserves, and with around 600 million hectares of uncultivated arable land, roughly 60% of the global total, Africa has the potential to become the world's breadbasket. By 2040, the continent is projected to have the largest labor force in the world of 1 billion workers. Channeling this reservoir of human capital to productive sectors offers unrivaled economic and social opportunities for Africa. Well, 2014 presented mixed fortunes for the African economy. The Ebola outbreak, however, led to projected economic recessions in affected West African countries and hurt the tourism sector of most other African economies, regardless of how far from the epicenter the rest of Africa is. Weak economic policies have also denied top African economies from benefiting from a fall in the global price of crude. Let's take a look at the highs and lows of the African economy in 2014.
This time last year, optimism surrounded the Africa Rising narrative, supported by a growing and young population, expanding middle class, discoveries of oil and other minerals, political stability and infrastructure developments. The continent had survived the global economic meltdown, and for many the worst had passed. Few foresaw the challenges that would shake the continent to its core. Then Ebola struck. The hardest hit countries, including Liberia, Sierra Leone and Guinea, all forced to revise economic growth projections downwards, with Sierra Leone and Guinea facing an economic recession following a dip in business activity.
When Ebola struck, one of the first areas it hit was trade, because now you could not, it interfered with transport movement. As a result, it ceased making sense to invest.
You've seen a sharp slump in tourism as far as South Africa and Kenya, a slowdown in air travel, economic activity has been badly impacted.
Another problem that severely affected the continent was the rise of terrorism. Nigeria in West Africa has for the better part of the year been entangled in fights with Boko Haram insurgents, while Kenya towards the east fought with al-Shabaab terrorists. Egypt, Libya, Morocco and Algeria are battling small divisions of the al-Qaeda terrorist group.
The frequency of incidents, the number of people dying, it has gone off the charts in 2014. It's taken a quantum leap.
2014 also saw the fall of South Africa as Africa's biggest economy. This followed a rebasing exercise by Nigeria, which now has a gross domestic product of $509.9 billion. Sectors such as e-commerce, mobile phone and the film industry significantly contributed to growth.
In terms of what really matters, say for government spending, it's tax revenues more than what the size of the economy is.
While countries like Ghana, Zambia and Mali sought bailout programs to get their books in order, Egypt scored a first after successfully financing the initial phase of the Suez Canal expansion from internal sources, impressing the International Monetary Fund that has given the country a clean bill of health. Another shock for the continent was to come in the form of tumbling oil prices. While this would signal good tidings for non-oil export-dependent economies, Nigeria and Angola have paid dearly for their overdependence on the black gold. Prices dropped to below $70 a barrel.
For the African consumer, of which Kenya is currently a consumer economy, this is going to be a stimulus. It's going to be a democratic stimulus because we all need oil. to some degree in our daily lifestyles.
Though it was a tough year for Africa, economists believe that intra-Africa trade, a dip in oil prices and diversification of energy sources will be the major catalyst for growth in 2015. Clementine Logan, CCTV.
Well, Africa has a great chance to transform itself and lift millions out of poverty. In 2014, the continent registered an average growth rate of 5.5%, and 2015 projections show this trend continuing, with the fastest growing economies on the continent registering up to 7% growth rates. Now, the World Bank's Vice President for Africa, Makta Diop, shares his insights and optimism with CCTV Africa.
It's a huge potential. Africa has been growing consistently for the last decade, 5% on average. And there has been a growth which has been really helping reducing poverty. Not at the fast rate as we wished, but we've been able to have serious dent in poverty in Africa. And more importantly, Africa is becoming one of the main destinations for investors in the worldwide. Liquidity on the capital market is now more and more directed towards Africa. People are seeing new opportunities investing in Africa, in ICT, in manufacturing, etc., etc. And China actually has been an important partner in that revival of the African economy.
Can you give us an idea of the potential challenges, though, for African economies at this time, and what really needs to be dealt with over the next 12 months or so?
The potential is equal because we have the fastest population growth in the world. We have also a fastest rate of urbanization. So we have, combined with economic growth, we have right now a growing middle class, which has a higher purchasing power, and we should be able to consume a lot of goods which are produced in Africa, but produced also outside. It's also given opportunity for the productive sector in Africa to move in the value chain and to move from just producing raw commodities to transforming them for consumption by the new middle class in Africa and the new urban population. This is one part. Secondly, we have possibility also to export in sectors where we have less export in the past. Let me give you an example, garment. As the prices and wages are increasing in some part of the world, where they used to produce garment, for instance, we have now an opportunity for African country to invest that sector and be able to export. And it's starting already in places like Ethiopia, and where there were some investment which are made by China actually to be able to attack in apparel, in shoes and garment. And it's something that also happened in your own country in Kenya, when you had the AGOA exercise, where you saw a lot of light manufacturing booming in Africa. So there is a potential for light manufacturing in Africa.
There is a potential, though, but African countries are now saying they no longer want to be just a supplier of raw materials. Are we really seeing a concrete effort of that changing?
Yeah, concrete effort. And actually, most of the investors, as I indicated earlier, like China, are starting investing in manufacturing, and they have started already in other places. So what are the challenges to accelerate that process? That's what the question you are asking me. We have still some factor of production which are still expensive in Africa. Electricity in most of the African country is not, the supply of electricity is not sufficient, and when it exists, it's sometimes too high a cost. So it affects the competitiveness of African countries when they're producing this type of goods. So we need to address infrastructure, and in infrastructure, the #1 priority is electricity.
All right, Mr. Diop, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Africa's economies are surging and foreign investment is exploding, even though the challenges, including Ebola, are immense. But the continent may finally be ready to deliver on its promise. The phrase Africa rising, now commonplace, describes a continent whose past dire limitations are translating into astonishing business opportunities as African economies expand. But is Africa rising a reality or an illusion? When we come back from the break, my guests on the program will weigh in on this issue. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, over the past decade, 6 of the world's fastest growing economies have been in Africa. In 8 of the past 10 years, Africa has grown faster than East Asia. So what has been the outlook in 2014? Well, joining us to share some insights on Africa's economic growth and its possible transformative potential is Mr. Konstantin Makarov. He is the Managing Director at StratLink Global here in Nairobi. Also joining us, Mr. Kwame Owino, the Chief Executive at the Institute of Economic Affairs, also here in Nairobi. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Kwame, I'll start off with you. 4.7% in 2013, 5.2% in 2014. What's been the economic outlook, though, for Africa in 2014?
Well, Beatrice, I never talk about Africa as if it's a single, because I think even right now we can tell, just going towards Nigeria and even within our neighborhood, I think the growth experience is different. Some countries are doing very, very well, others not. And so some, as we said, I think it's got a regional character, but on the whole, the momentum for growth seems to be maintaining. Perhaps not so for Kenya in my view, but it seems to be maintaining for a large number. I mean, most of the countries that have been doing well. We're talking about Ethiopia and a few others. But on the whole, yes, some African countries are doing well, others not so well.
Which ones are doing well, and what's driving the growth there?
Well, let's talk about Ethiopia to start with. I think north of 6%, that's very, very good. Very, very good growth. Of course, it's from a low base. In our neighborhood, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda as well, well ahead of 5% growth GDP over the last 3 or 4 years. So that in itself is a good thing. I think in the west of Africa, Nigeria had maintained, of course, not getting to very high levels, but on the whole it had maintained. But we know that with the commodity prices and specifically oil, I think the government is looking at a different growth picture. In Kenya as well, we obviously have also, in the last, I think, 12 months, revised growth picture downwards twice.
Right.
So growth is taking place, but I think the acceleration that was to take us beyond middle range growth towards 10%, I think it's clear now that it's going to take much, much more than business as usual to get it forward.
All right. In terms of strategy, though, Konstantin, in terms of strategy, what are some of the internal and external factors, though, that have contributed to either the lack of growth or the strong growth on the continent in 2014?
I think one of the most important things is diversification of the economy. So if we look at East versus West Africa, and I don't like to say versus, but I think economically you have to look at it that way. What's happening now with oil prices being quite down is East Africa is looking a lot more attractive from an investor point of view, where the economies are diversified. If you look at Kenya, for example, you have financial services, you have ICT, you have horticulture. So there is plenty to choose from in terms of investing, what to invest in. I think what we would be very keen on and we will be looking at is more government policy to ensure that the momentum for growth continues on through 2015. We've been fairly happy with what we saw in 2014 in East Africa, and we're hoping for the best. I would say cautiously optimistic for East Africa. I think East Africa will dominate the news in the next year.
All right. The big oil exporting countries, though, Angola, Nigeria, Ghana, that have not diversified their economies, how badly hurt are they?
I think they'll be quite hurt in the coming year. The bright star in those countries will be Gabon. Gabon has been on a very interesting trajectory. The government realized that they needed to diversify over the last 2 years, and they're moving their economy more towards agriculture, and you're seeing substantial improvements in the percentage that agriculture represents of the larger economy. I think you can't go away from export of oil and oil exploration in West Africa, but it is interesting to see, and it's a positive indication that the government is getting smarter and more responsible with what they're doing with their economies.
All right. Kwame, though, you're talking about Africa being, I mean, it's a whole region with some countries posting strong growth, others not posting strong growth, but which sectors, though, across the board are likely to post strong growth in coming years?
Well, again, it differs by country. I think, for instance, in Kenya, even if you talk about agriculture, some agriculture sectors actually doing okay. I think, for instance, Kenya's horticulture, which is very high value, and with the conclusion of the economic partnership agreement with of course, the full details are not out, but at least it's been concluded substantially with Europe. It's clear that exports will continue to grow. Tea has moderated quite a bit. I think we need to look at what the weather will be like over the next 12 months to know what the output will be. But in terms of production, that is here. Tanzania as well, I think, was looking forward, and Mozambique too was looking forward to expanding gas and all those. So they've made a lot of investments Mozambique in particular has made a lot of investments in trying to get a pipeline through, and there was preparation for big investments over that. With oil prices moderating, I think there may be a little bit of caution about how much or how soon those will contribute to growth. But in the medium term, agriculture, I think, is one, because that will happen here. Ethiopia as well, obviously, we'll see that from agriculture. There's a little bit of trying to build into manufacturing. That tends to be a medium term to longer term. But I think the major push for the time being will be agriculture, both for domestic consumption with the possibility of exports into Europe and other parts of the world.
There's a lot of optimism, though, coming from both you gentlemen about the continent's economic prospects in 2015 and, also looking at 2014, though. But the continent has faced some challenges, though. What are the key challenges, though, that the continent has faced in 2014 that has led to sort of like a regression of that growth in some countries?
Sure. I would say that what was interesting to see is the Ebola outbreak. Nobody wants to talk about it now. I think it's kind of on the back pages right now, but I think it is important to see what happens and what the perception outside of Africa was in terms of how the continent dealt with the problem overall. If you look at East Africa, and even though we did not have cases of Ebola in East Africa, if you look at, say, Kenya Airways, the national carrier, their profits have been hurt tremendously by the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. And it just shows how important intra-African trade is. And I would like to concentrate on that for I would say, the next 2015, 2016, to continuously look at the importance of intra-African trade, but also some of the shortcomings, and how do we plan for potential risks that intra-African trade presents.
All right, Kwame, though, are you seeing that potential, though, for intra-African trade? Because we are seeing, like the Southern African region, I think, is well on its way to proper interconnectivity.
Well, yes, I think, but I think the leader, without doubt, I don't say that because I live here, but the leader, without doubt, in terms of regional integration and the ability to open up trade is East Africa. I think we've seen some tentative steps in the last few days, last few months, but that's been resolved in Kenya and Uganda. So in that respect, I think the ESC will actually lead. But let's go back to the question of risks. And one of the big risks, in my view, is that Africa, and even starting with our own country of Kenya, is on the queues of a democratic recession, in the sense that democratic gains that went together with political gains that went together with economic reforms are actually getting reversed. Africa has been here before. We are going to pay a big price if it goes like this. All right.
Kwame, you feel the same?
I will take a slightly opposite position. I think what is happening is you're seeing capitalism really coming into the forefront of Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think if you leave it to the market to dictate how it reacts to good and bad political decisions, I think time will tell. For us as representing a few investors from outside of Africa, that's the most important way they vote. They vote with their dollars. So though there may be some challenges, and I think it's a painful road to get to a fully democratic society that has freedoms of economic freedoms, personal freedoms, etc. I think as long as the vision is there will be hiccups along the way. But I think to manage that perception, and if we're going to stick to have our conversation focused on business, business will vote with their dollars.
So, in other words, though, what you're saying is that whether or not that democratic situation regresses, bottom line is the investors still have a lot of investor confidence, though, on the continent if it is market dictated.
Absolutely. I think what happens is if there are political challenges and political concerns, they will be priced into any transaction. So what that means is perhaps, again, for the person selling their business or allowing foreign investors in, they will get less and have to give up more, but it does not mean that the flows will stop.
All right, gentlemen, so I want us to talk a bit about the prospects going into 2015 now. And just to go back briefly to a World Bank report this year, where it mentioned Africa as being on the brink of an economic takeoff, much like China was 30 years ago and India some 20 years ago. Are we seeing that now happening in Africa for a fact?
And I would answer that with going back to how Kwame started this session. And I think that the issue with that comparison is that you're comparing countries to a continent that is not homogeneous, does not have the rule of law that's the same across the continent, that speaks various languages. So to implement any policy is a bit difficult. I would like to look at Africa in regions. And I think you have East, West, Central, and Southern Africa. Each one has its strengths, each one has its weaknesses. So if if you would ask me where I think the most growth will come from within Sub-Saharan Africa, it would be from the East and the West. I think the East will lead the next 5 years in terms of growth from a absolute perspective, not necessarily from a percentage, but we'll see the most amount of growth happening in East Africa within the bloc, within the EAC, followed by West Africa, Southern Africa, and unfortunately Central Africa will be lagging behind for the foreseeable future.
Where does that leave North Africa though?
North Africa is in a different category completely, specifically when you look at it from an economic perspective. It's a bit more homogeneous. You have a more historical trade routes and more historical agreements in place that have been honored for generations. Where we see Sub-Saharan Africa, everything is a bit new. You have Angola recovering from 20 plus years of civil war. You have Mozambique recovering from war. And the growth we're seeing is that it's that stability, and the stability paying its dividends. Once we have stability, you'll have investment coming in. As soon as there's instability, and we have seen it before, you'll see foreign direct investment outflows instead of inflows.
All right, Kwame?
Okay, I think your question was about, as you mentioned, that
are we seeing, my question was about a World Bank report which says Africa could be on the brink of an economic takeoff.
Yes, some African countries will certainly make it. I think a good number of African countries are actually flatter to deceive and will not. Again, he may disagree. I think that Africa is in the place, and Kenya specifically, Eastern African countries are in the place where they have to do that very delicate balance of both political economic reforms on one side together with economic reforms. I mean, political reforms and economic. It's not an easy engine to run, but if Africa and East African countries do not do that, then yes, they will have high rates of growth, but they will not be able to sustain. Because historically, all African countries individually have never had a problem of high growth rates. What they've had is a problem of maintaining those growth rates, which is where China comes in. What China did was actually got high growth rates and maintained them for 25, one full generation. No African country has ever done that. So basically, that's why political reforms on one side are required with economic reforms, all going together, taking advantage of the demographic dividend, which Africa also has a very, very young population, which definitely will be politically engaged at the same time as they wish to be economically engaged. If we make the decision to shut one side, definitely that will not be. Because my view is foreign direct investment is certainly important, but foreign direct investment alone is not enough to push Africa forward. In fact, domestic political reforms are actually what takes many countries forward as well.
Constantine?
I do agree with you, and I think stability is extremely important. However, for political reforms to happen, revenue collection has to exist. Without revenue collection in form of tax, you cannot improve your roads, you cannot improve your bridges, you cannot improve the quality of life to facilitate the personal freedoms that we all want. So I think I agree with you completely, and it is a delicate balance. However, I think that emphasis on economic reforms and economic liberties will spill over into civil liberties.
Kwame, you still disagree?
No. Well, we are saying the same thing, but in different ways. But one of the things that I wish to stress again, he's correct, but one of the things that I wish to stress again is what I see is that many African countries may read the history of China completely wrong and decide that these are people who are actually repressed. The unfortunate thing is it may have been true, but Africa and Kenya, many Kenyan African countries are in the place where we actually started those political reforms, and people have had a taste of them. So to think that we can actually shrink those in the service of political economic reforms when the political system, economic system itself is actually considered illegitimate in many countries because we have very huge inequalities would be a mistake.
We're only talking now about one country here, Kenya, but now across the continent though, let's fast forward to 2015. What are the challenges that are likely to be faced in 2015? What are the issues that are of immediate concern that should be addressed in the next 12 months, so to speak, if we have to maintain this sustained optimism and sustained growth on the continent?
Well, let's start with, I call them the anchor countries. Let's talk about the West is basically Nigeria. And Nigeria's growth will actually give you an inkling about how the rest of West Africa, broadly speaking, could do. I think Nigeria's major problem, and I think its governors of the central bank and its economic managers seem to actually have their finger on the pulse, which is basically to manage the shocking revenues that may actually reduce. And among the things they're thinking about is, well, let's look about alternative sources of revenue. They've actually scaled down what the budget expenditure would be, so they're making the right decisions broadly. If they make those decisions, then the shock on growth may not be as large as it would otherwise be. And they've begun to prepare everybody for the fact that, look, we may have to tighten our belts for a while. That would be a good reason. On the part of East Africa, I think Kenya as well. We have Tanzania is going through both economic and political reforms in terms of a new constitution. So it's not only Kenyan. I think how that does is something that I get the impression many people think we need to look at. How the new constitution comes in to keep the country together and that. Going down to South Africa, I think it's more of a mixed picture. I think South Africa is in a place where they actually need to engage new gears, systematic reforms, basically, which will be politically painful without doubt. If that happens, 2015 and the medium term will look much, much better. So basically, the picture I'm painting for you is big decisions will have to be made. I think the momentum is there, but it will be momentum that gives you 4 or 5% of growth. That will not be enough for Kenya, South Africa, and certainly not for Nigeria. All
right. Constantine, your projections?
We project overall, and I will give you a number, I think that's what you're asking. If we're projecting between 5 and 5.5% growth for Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, that's based on our models, and that's a fairly wide range to look at. And I think that's very much achievable. I think 2015 will be a year of challenges for most of the countries. You have a very strong dollar, which translates to a potential inflation issues. You have what we call the year of the elections. You have at least 4 or 5 different major elections happening on the continent, to include one of the darlings in Ethiopia, and the other darling, which is Tanzania. And we'll see what happens there. And for us, I think security and stability will be the focal area that we will look at. And I think that's why I say that 2015 will be a challenging year, and it will be also a very exciting year to see what happens and what reforms and policies will be passed.
All right, a final comment from both of you. The phrase Africa rising, do we still believe in that?
It's not as, I would say yes, we do believe in it. It's not as simple as people like to make it seem. I think countries in Africa are rising. The countries that are passing the correct laws, the correct legislation, and that do have the economic reforms necessary for them to rise to their potential. But Africa as a continent, I think it would be a bit naive for all of us to say that the entire continent is rising.
All right, Kwame?
I mean, similar comments. I think some African countries are doing the right things, making the difficult decision that needs to be made, and also have realized that the 20 years, I mean, the first phase of reforms that were done in the late 90s and early noughties have actually gotten us so far. We need to engage a second set of gears, both political development and economic development. So some of them will definitely make progress. East Africa is right up there. I think if the right decisions are made, especially regarding integration around and coming political waters, certainly the best will happen. Some countries have more difficult ones. I think Nigeria, for instance, has a difficult thing on the northeast that we need not to speak about. South Africa has a difficult thing as well, basically about getting the second decade after independence and dealing with disillusionment that many people have had. So if those do well, then you can talk about generally the rest of Africa following through.
All right, Kwame Owino, Chief Executive at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Konstantin Makarov, Managing Director at Strategic Global. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us here on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Goodbye.